Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here, and today I want to answer a question that has been on my mind for a while. Now, if you've been watching my videos, you probably know that I'm an absolute sucker for underdog specs, like the Balanced Druid and Elemental Shaman in Classic, and also the Smite Priest in the Burning Crusade. And since TBC is getting closer and closer, it got me thinking, is this actually viable in Classic TBC? Now, my biggest gripe with the Smite Priest was always that they run out of mana very fast, and therefore I could never really recommend it that much for raiding. However, what we've all seen in Classic is that bosses are being killed in record time, even to the point where something like a Balanced Druid, which is well known for going out of mana very fast, doesn't even have to use a mana potion anymore in several fights. And that got me thinking, with the way bosses are being cleared so quickly, maybe the Smite Priest actually has a chance of shining in the Burning Crusade and being viable. Now, let me be clear here. Being viable is something different than being very competitive on the damage meters. I seriously doubt a Smite Priest will be up there in raids like Gruul's Lair, tying the damage with Warlocks and Hunters. And hey, if that does happen, then I stand corrected. What I mean is if they're able to pull their own weight and do competent damage. Now, what exact DPS number is competent in TBC is hard to tell, especially since the average amount of DPS might change drastically in Classic TBC. But based on my years of playing on private servers and scouring around on the internet, I think it's safe to say that an average of 900 to 1000 DPS is something everyone can live with as competent DPS. Again, not super competitive, not top DPS, but just good enough DPS where it's actually viable. So first I'd like to show you guys the spec that I came up with and the rotation that I'm using. Bear in mind that there is almost no information about the TBC Smite Priest out there, so I had to try and come up with this stuff by myself for the most part. And hey, consider this a bit of a prototype if you will, and if you have a lot of experience with actually being a Smite Priest in TBC and you have a different spec or you have some really good tips, then I'd be happy to hear them, and perhaps I'll make an update video in the near future. So for the talents, I have this spec right here. First up, I have 5 points in Unbreakable Will, which increases your chance to resist stun, fear and silence effects by an additional 15%. Now, while this sounds like more of a PvP talent, resisting a CC by a boss or some adds in a dungeon means you're able to pump out more DPS, which is nice. And the other talent increases wand damage, which is not really that great since we're going for a scenario where you will not use a wand to damage the boss. Next talent is Martyrdom, which is really handy if for whatever reason you get hit by an ad or a boss and it's a crit, which causes you to suffer no pushback for 6 seconds, which again will allow you to do more damage compared to your spells constantly getting pushed back. Now with this spec I chose not to go with improved Power Word Fortitude, but go with improved Power Word Shield to add some extra survivability to your character. And there's a good to fair chance there will be a healing priest that does have that talent. But again, this heavily depends on your raid comp, so you could possibly swap out the improved shield talents and go for the improved Fortitude, which could also be a better option in 5-man dungeon runs where you're the only priest in the group. So with those 5 talent points we unlock the next level of talents, and first we get Inner Focus, which when activated reduces the mana cost of your next spell by 100% and increases its critical strike chance by 25%. So basically a mini elemental mastery if you will, and considering how a Smite Priest consumes a lot of mana, it's nice to have that one free spell every 3 minutes. And then 3 points in Meditation for 30% mana regen, which is of course a pretty obvious choice. This leaves us with one throwaway talent which you can put wherever you want, though in this case I put it in Silent Resolve, which slightly reduces the threat by your Holy and Discipline spells by 4% and reduces the chance of your spells being dispelled by 4%. Not huge, but it's at least something that will reduce your threat a little bit, which probably won't be too much of an issue in raids, but maybe kinda useful when running dungeons. After that we slap 5 points in Mental Agility for 10% mana reduction for instant spells, which is pretty nice considering we're going to use Shadow Word Pain and Shadow Word Death in our rotation, which of course are both instant spells. Then we also get Divine Spirit and the improved Divine Spirit. As you'll see in this video, Spirit is a pretty useful stat that gives us a big boost in spell damage. So having Divine Spirit and the increased version will offer us a lot more damage. There is a chance your raid comp will have a priest that has this, but since this is such a crucial buff, I decided to still get this in situations where you're the only priest in your dungeon party or raid. And after that we put 5 points in mental strength for a very useful and much needed 10% increase of our mana. Then we slap 5 points in force of will, which increases your spell damage by 5% and also gives you 5% extra crit chance with offensive spells, which kinda speaks for itself, followed by the last talent, Power Infusion, which increases the casting speed of your spells by 20%, while also reducing the mana cost of all spells by 20% for 15 seconds. A pretty huge DPS increase and also a mana decrease, so an absolute must if you ask me. Now one more thing I'd like to mention in the Holy Tree is the talent Focused Power, which increases the chance to hit with Smite, Mind Blast and Master Spell by 4%, and a reduced cast time of 1 second on your Master Spell with 2 talent points. And that 4% on Smite and Mind Blast seems pretty nice, but I decided not to go with this as you will use many other spells in your rotation, which means it's much better to just get hit capped all around and spend those 2 talent points somewhere else. Still though, if you're really struggling for extra spell hit, you could take these as a temporary solution just so your Smite hits a little bit more reliable. Alright, so moving over to the Holy Tree. First we have Holy Specialization, which increases the critical strike chance of your holy spells by 5%, which is obviously really nice for Smite and Holy Fire. Then 5 points in Divine Fury for half a second cast time off your Smite, Holy Fire, Heal and Greater Heal spell, which again is pretty obvious. The next talent we get is Holy Nova, and this is actually a pretty huge talent. Now Shadow Priest and TBC are pretty decent DPSers, but they have almost no AoE abilities. And with this talent you can actually do a pretty decent amount of holy damage in packs of mobs, like the ghosts in Karasan close to Moros for instance, so it's definitely worth getting. The next few talents are whatever you want, as we just need 4 talent points to get to the next level of talents. However, in this case I decided to get 3 talents in Blessed Recovery, so when you're the victim of a critical strike, you will heal yourself for 25% of that damage over 6 seconds, which means you'll be able to heal yourself without having to stop DPS, and it takes a little bit of pressure off the healers in your group or raid. This gives us a total of 4 talent points, so the last talent point in this range is again another throwaway talent that you can put wherever you want. I decided to put one in Spell Warding as that reduces all spell damage taken by 2%. Not a huge difference, but it makes us just a little bit less squishy. Alright, on to the good stuff. First up, Searing Light for a pretty tasty 10% extra damage on Smite and Holy Fire, which is pretty self-explanatory. Then Holy Reach for 20% range on your Smite and Holy Fire, and also 20% increased radius for Prayer of Healing, Holy Nova and Circle of Healing, which means being able to hit more targets while spamming Holy Nova to do AoE damage. And as you can see we have 4 talent points spent here, so the 5th point is again a throwaway talent, which I will put in Spell Warding again for a total of 4% reduced spell damage taken. Then we get to the big one, Spiritual Guidance, which increases spell damage and healing by up to 25% of your total spirit. Now let me put this into perspective. Any decently geared priest in TBC, depending on your gear, will have a good chunk of spirit at max level, which means this talent, alongside that Divine Spirit buff, could potentially give you an extra 100 spell damage just from talents and buffs alone. That is pretty huge, which is exactly why we use 5 points on this one. And then last but definitely not least, Surge of Light, which gives your spell crits a 50% chance to cause your next Smite spell to be an instant cast, cost no mana, but be incapable of a critical hit. Now while the instant cast is not really that huge, as a global cooldown is 1.5 seconds and Smite is only 2 seconds, the most important thing is that you will be able to dish out a decent amount of Smite that costs no mana, further increasing your longevity as a Smite priest. One more note I'd like to add here is that you could leave out 1 point in Force of Will and use that to get Spirit of Redemption, which gives you an extra 5% spirit. And while that's not huge, it does give you a little bit more spell damage, mana regen, and it could be kinda handy too for when you as a Smite priest die, because then you can at least contribute a bit of healing to the raid. So yeah, also a viable option, but more focused on some extra support. And well, for now, that is the Smite Priest spec. I'd like to remind you one more time that this is just a bit of a prototype spec, and any tips and trips are more than welcome. One thing people might wonder is why I didn't go for Spirit Tap, which gives you a 100% Spirit bonus after killing a target, which can give you a decent chunk of extra spell damage. And the simple reason is that this spec is mainly focused on dungeons and raid content, where the chance of you actually delivering the last hit to a target to get this buff is very small. Though I do agree that out in the world on your own, this is a very strong talent. Alright, now after that long introduction to the talents, I'd like to talk to you guys about the rotation. The rotation that I have come up with so far is this one. First, you use Holy Fire as an opener, as Holy Fire, while being a long cast, does good damage and adds an extra dot to the target. Then you add Shadow Word Pain, and you keep that on the target, so be sure to refresh it when it falls off. Next, you cast Shadow Word Death, which is an instant cast that does good damage, and you should use this every time it comes off of cooldown. And in between the cooldown of Shadow Word Death and refreshing Shadow Word Pain, you use Smite as your main damaging spell. Besides this, make sure you use your cooldowns like Inner Focus and Shadow Fiend when you're getting low on mana. Also, depending on your class, you could throw some racials in there. For instance, if you're an Undead Priest, you can use Devouring Plague in your rotation as well. And for now, I decided not to use Mind Blast in the rotation because I found it to be too mana expensive, and a Smite has a chance to get that Surge of Light proc. I found that this rotation right here offers a good balance between damage output and longevity. But again, if you know a better rotation, then I'd love to know. So all that theory is nice and all, but what about the actual damage output? Well, in order to test that, I returned to my DPS arena on my own TBC server, gave myself some buffs and consumables, applied some debuffs to a stunned raid boss, and used 2 gear levels to see just how much DPS I could do. The buff and consumable setup is not ideal, as unfortunately this 2.4.3 core that I have doesn't allow every single buff there is, like for instance multiple paladin buffs. A bit of a shame, but as of right now this is the best I can do. I did try to simulate an optimal raiding environment for the Smite Priest to give it the best fighting chance, meaning it has Moonkin aura, totems, Sanctity aura, as well as the target having Seal of the Crusader debuff besides the other debuffs it has. And of course consumables were also used like a flask, spell power food and wizard oil to further simulate an actual raiding environment, with also a bloodlust pop. This did mean I had to scour a TBC database for all the different auras and debuffs and create macros where on demand I could get those buffs, debuffs and consumables. But I think it's only fair to try and give one of my favorite classes and specs the best fighting chance. Alright, so time to find out if a Smite Priest can do competent damage, as well as not go out of mana too fast. The first gear level is pre-raid gear, and then the second gear level will be some tier 4 items thrown in there. First, let's start with pre-raid gear. Now remember, the DPS we're shooting for is 900 to 1000. Well, in this gear, the priest did an average of 1055.1 DPS, and I lasted about 1 minute 57 seconds before going out of mana. This is with the use of Shadow Fiend. So while the DPS is not too shabby, the longevity is not exactly amazing, though this can be extended a little bit by using mana potions, or maybe striking a deal with a druid who can innervate you. But overall, not too bad if you ask me. And then we move on to the second gear level. In this case, the priest has 2 out of 2 spell strike, some tier 4 pieces, as unfortunately our priest can't get anything like Frozen Shadow Weave or Spellfire, the blade from Prince Malchezaar, and a bunch of other epic goodies thrown in there. And in this gear level, the priest did a pretty nice 1211.8 DPS, and it lasted about the same with a total time of 1 minute 58 seconds, again with the use of Shadow Fiend. So in both cases, the Smite Priest exceeded my expectations with his DPS, though as you can see, the Smite Priest just can't last very long without potions, an innervate or something else. But as I said before, there's a really good to fair chance that that might be long enough in Classic TBC, considering just how quick bosses are being brought down in Classic. Of course, in Classic TBC there will not be as much buffs available, as world buffs aren't really a thing anymore, but the addition of some mana potions and the increased kill speed could mean the Smite Priest can last just long enough before going out of mana during a boss fight. Also, please keep in mind that in an actual raid environment, the damage I deal to myself with Shadow or Death would be healed up by a healer, and that in an actual boss fight there's of course a lot more factors that come into play, like mechanics, movement, CC and whatnot. Of course, it's important to compare this to the other, much more popular option of doing DPS, which is Shadow. Well, believe it or not, in terms of pure damage, the Smite Priest can actually match the Shadow Priest quite well, as the Shadow Priest does around 900-ish damage in blues and about 1100 damage with epics like the full Frozen Shadow Weave set and Spell Strike set. Of course, what the Shadow Priest does bring is a big amount of extra buffs. We're talking Vampiric Touch, Vampiric Embrace, Shadow Weaving, Misery, and all those things are quite huge, and they are all things the Smite Priest unfortunately can bring to the raid. So while it is a huge amount of fun to play one, and while they do good damage, they unfortunately don't bring anywhere near the utility a Shadow Priest brings, and admittedly Shadow Priests do last a bit longer before going And well, there you go guys, a bit of a guide / investigation on the Smite Priest in the Burning Crusade and whether it will be viable in classic TBC. And well, it does pump out some pretty decent damage. Though obviously in the more hardcore guilds, it's gonna be hard to find a raid spot as a Smite Priest, as it's just not part of an ideal raid comp. But it might be really fun to use for an alt run or a more casual guild. I hope I was able to explain enough regarding this class and spec, and I'd like to remind you one last time that any feedback on the spec, the rotation and whatnot is more than welcome. And that's gonna do it for today. As always, I want to thank you for watching. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.